Hello, friends, and welcome back to Scattered Thoughts, a mini cast where we talk about whatever in the world of magic we feel like talking about today. My name's Timothy. I'm going to be your host for Scattered Thoughts, and today we are talking about mistakes that you are making in Commander. Now, I don't expect everybody to play Commander perfectly. It's not limited, it's not constructed. There's usually 4+ players playing at one time. Commander's a lot less about making the correct play and more about making informed or smart decisions that can lead you towards winning the game. But still, I see a lot of new and veteran players making very common mistakes that hopefully I can point out and help you avoid moving forward. A lot of this is going to be geared towards people who don't necessarily consume a lot of Magic content and are looking to up their game by just pointing out little things they should be on the lookout for. These are things that often help in limited Magic as well, which is kind of my area of expertise, but they transfer over to Commander as well. And I think these are the type of things that if you're on the lookout for and you try to correct yourself and engage with these mistakes and try to avoid these mistakes, you'll probably win a game or two more than you would otherwise. We are going to break this down into 3 main categories of mistakes. The first one being gameplay mistakes, actual decision making that you're either doing or not doing that is costing you some sort of win percentage or some sort of equity in a game. We are going to go over some mechanical mistakes. These are non-gameplay related mistakes that involve interpreting things incorrectly or not reading things correctly. Basically non-gameplay mistakes. And then finally, we're going to go over some deck building mistakes. Things that people do while building their deck that are costing them in-game. These are a little bit harder to see sometimes because you might make deck building errors that just don't come out in the wash when you're playing games, or you might attribute a deck building error to something that actually happened in gameplay when it actually involved the way you built your deck in the first place. That's actually very common for limited Magic as well. If you built your deck, quote-unquote, incorrectly, then that might reflect in the matches, but it looks more like what's happening in the matches that cause you to lose rather than a deck building error. So gameplay errors, mechanical errors, and deck building errors. And naturally, I want to preface this all by saying I am not a perfect Magic player. I'm not perfect at any format that I've ever played, especially Commander. In fact, I don't even try to be perfect at Commander, but I do try to be good. I try to make informed decisions. I try to avoid these sorts of mistakes. Some of them are going to be a little more obvious. Some of them are going to be less obvious. And some of them might even be a little bit controversial depending on your opinion. But I do feel very strongly about the list here. We're going to go rapid fire here, basically. There's no set number of mistakes that I've pointed out. I just have a list that I wanted to talk about, things that I've been jotting down for a while now, paying attention to in my games that I'm going to point out here, and hopefully that will help you improve as a Commander player. So why don't we start off with the gameplay errors, the ones that you're actually making a decision while playing the game and that is costing you some sort of equity in the game because you are making a weird or otherwise incorrect decision. And just to kind of highlight the way we're going to do this, let's start off with one that really irks me, and I think irks a lot of people, but comes up very, very often, and that is rolling a die to figure out who you're going to attack or who you're going to interact with. You see this happen very, very often in the early stages of the game. Perhaps somebody played a creature on turn 1 or turn 2. Nobody else has played a creature. They're just playing their mana rocks and their setup pieces and stuff like that, maybe some tap lands, and it comes back to the player who has the only creature on board, and obviously they want to get an attack in, right? Nobody's able to block. You might as well get some damage in, but they don't really know who they want to attack, so they roll a die to figure out who is going to take some damage. This isn't quite a mistake on the same level as other things. I think this is more of a psychological mistake, and I'm no psychologist. I don't know how the human brain works. I'm not even going to pretend to know how. So if there are any psychologists out there, feel free to correct me or chime in or let me know why this happens. But I think the reason people do this, the reason people roll a die to see who's going to take damage and who's going to get attacked, is because it feels less personal, or at least it feels like you're not intentionally trying to make an enemy if you attacked someone by random chance rather than actively choosing to attack that person, right? It feels a lot less personal if the die told you to attack me than if you actively made the decision to attack me. Now, if I'm the defending player and you attack me for 2 and you've announced, hey, I'm attacking you, you're going to take 2 damage, that's going to feel a little bit personal to me, and I'm probably going to retaliate. People always make that joke about retaliating because you attacked me for 1 early on in the game, right? But I'm probably going to retaliate. You attacked me, right? But if I'm the defending player and you just happen to randomly roll, well, it doesn't feel as personal. You attacked me because the die said you had to attack, so I don't need to retaliate. At least that's the mentality that I think people are going for when they leave an attack up to a random die. And the reason I consider this a mistake is because you should be making informed decisions during the game. If you leave things up to random chance, you're probably missing out on dealing some damage to the person who's going to pull ahead over the course of the game. Now, sometimes you do play a creature on turn 2, nobody does anything, and everybody's basically at parity, and it is kind of a random chance who you attack, but you should stop and do some decision making. You should look for context in the game. You should be attacking people who you think are going to have an advantage, even if it's not immediately apparent, and if there is no real advantage to be discerned there, just make a choice and attack that person. The advantages that we're talking about here. Did somebody play Soul Ring on turn 1? Maybe you played your creature on turn 2. On turn 2, an opponent untapped their tap land, played a Soul Ring and a Signet. Yeah, maybe you should attack the person who's ramping ahead. Did somebody play Sylvan Library? You should be pressuring the person who can use their life as a resource because they have Sylvan Library. Did somebody play Mystic Remora and they're looking to draw a bunch of extra cards early in the game? Attack that person. Is someone's commander significantly more powerful than the rest of the table's commanders? Attack that person. Did your other players mulligan and only one person got to keep a 7-card hand? Attack the person who has most cards. These are the type of things you should be thinking of when it comes to attacking somebody, or at least choosing someone to attack. I get it, the die roll is not personal. Again, this isn't a huge mistake. You need to attack with your creature. That's what it's there for. Just make a choice. Decide this. It really bothers me when people leave it up to a die roll because they're giving up some sort of decision making there, and for a reason that I don't think is particularly valid. And if you are the person who gets attacked randomly because the die said to attack, don't use that as an excuse not to retaliate. The result is the same. Whether you attacked me for 2 or whether the die said to attack me for 2, I still took 2. My life total is the same either way. I'm going to hit you with my full force for attacking me early on in the game. That's what everybody does, right? Okay, so that's a big one that is more of an irksome thing than a full-on mistake, but the next one is actually a huge mistake that I think so many people do that I have to put it out there. This is using your treasure tokens before you use your lands for mana. Treasure is such an abundant thing in Commander right now. It's one of the characteristic things you can expect to see pretty much game in, game out to now. And I notice so many people are just using their treasures incorrectly. As a general rule of thumb, you should be using your lands for mana before you use your treasure for mana. As with all of these mistakes, there are going to be circumstances where that's not true. There are absolutely times where you should use your treasure first. But for the most part, if you don't expect to lose those treasures, you should be tapping your lands for mana first. And here's a perfect example to outline why. Imagine you're casting a 4-drop and you have 4 lands on the battlefield and 2 treasure tokens. Well, how are you going to cast that? Well, if we use our 2 treasure tokens and we tap 2 of our lands, sure, we get to cast that spell, but next turn when we untap, we're going to untap our 4 lands, we're out of treasure tokens, and we just have 4 mana to play with that turn. Now, in that same scenario, if I had just tapped all 4 of my lands for that spell instead, I get to carry those treasures over into the next turn, and when I untap for the next turn, I have 6 mana to work with. As long as I don't need to use all of my mana for the turn, the combined amount of lands and treasure I have, I should be using the treasure last so that I have the possibility to carry those over into another turn, basically floating that mana into another turn. I see so many people, especially when they gather a ton of treasures, that they just use their treasures first because it's the easiest way to tap for a spell, but you're giving up mana for a future turn. You're giving up ramp, basically. Use your lands first before you use your treasures. When is it not correct to do this? Well, A, it's incorrect to do this if you think that somebody's going to destroy your treasure tokens, right? If you have the suspicion that somebody's going to untap and Vandal Blast the board or Bane of Progress the board, then you should probably use those treasures while you can, otherwise they're going to go to waste. A more obvious example would be when you need the color fixin'. Obviously, if you're stuck on a color and your lands don't produce that color, sure, go ahead and use your treasure for that color if you need to. But in circumstances where your lands and your treasures are equally helping you cast your spells, your treasure should be the last thing you touch. They're also a resource if you have things that care about sacrifice and artifacts or permanents. So you usually want to sack treasure token, not lands, right? So you want to carry those treasures over into the last possible moment where you basically have to use them. The next one on our list goes without saying, but it happens so often that I'm going to point it out here. Cards with flash and instants should be used at the last possible moment. I see way too many people casting their flash creatures and their instants during their own turn, tapping out, and just letting the opponents have their way. You should be waiting until the last possible moment, which is usually the end step before you untap for your turn, to cast your spells, your instants, your flash creatures, and stuff like that. Obviously, if they're interactive, you want to use those in reaction to whatever your opponents are doing, and you might need to do that before the end step, before you untap. But that's the glory of not tapping out at sorcery speed for instants and flash cards, is that you then get to interact with what your opponents do. I think a card that highlights this being a mistake more than anything is Stunt Double. Stunt Double is the 4-mana flash clone that enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature. Now, if it's your turn and your opponent has, let's say, a Solemn Simulacrum on board, yeah, it's really tempting to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and flash in my Stunt Double and I get a Solemn Simulacrum. That's the easy mode way to think about it. But what happens when you do that and it goes through your opponent's turn cycles and someone plays a Diluvian Primordial? Well, now you really wish you had access to your Stunt Double because there's just a better target on board for it. And if you had waited and just kind of felt out what your opponents were doing, then yeah, you would have gotten a better target for your Stunt Double. Sometimes it's correct to go ahead and ignore this rule of thumb that I'm putting out here if you think your opponents have interaction and they're tapped out. There are a lot of control cards out there, counter spells and stuff like that, and sometimes you need to sneak in spells while your opponents are tapped out. But for the most part, if your creature has flash, there's no real reason to run it out at sorcery speed. You feel really silly when you do that, and then somebody untaps and wipes the board, when you could have held your flash creature in your hand and had that post-board wipe. Again, the best time to do things, assuming there's nothing that makes it so you should do otherwise, is the untap step before you, or rather the end step before you untap, when you've seen as much information about what your opponents are going to do. That gives you as many openings to react to the right thing as possible before you untap for your turn and get your mana back. You still end up using all your mana, but you wait and see whether you need to cast a different spell or react to a different thing by keeping your mana up and flashing your cards in on other people's turns and casting your instants on other people's turns. Another small mistake here that's easily fixed is not attacking with creatures that have vigilance. Going back to that scenario where you have a 2-drop creature and nobody else has a creature on board, attack somebody. Your creature has vigilance. You're not giving up anything. All of your opponents are tapped out. Even if it's 1 damage, get that chip damage in. Life is a resource in Commander. You might as well reduce your opponent's resources and reduce their life total while you can. If your creature has vigilance and it's 100% to get through on an opponent, go ahead and attack that opponent unless you have some alliance or, secret agreement with that person. Next up, this is a mistake that I make all the time. I'm really good at making this mistake. Introducing the Monarch into games where somebody can easily take it from you and you have no plan for taking it back. If you're going to introduce the Monarch into the game, you need to make sure that you've walled up enough that you get to keep it, or that you can take it back if somebody else takes it from you. The worst thing you can possibly do is introduce the Monarch into the game, draw an extra card on your end step, and then the person who has a bunch of evasive flyers and a bunch of tokens to block takes it from you, and now nobody else can take it back from them, and they get to just accumulate that resource for the rest of the game. I do this a lot. I have like a mill deck with very few creatures that has a couple ways to introduce the Monarch into the game, and then someone takes it from me and I have no creatures that can deal combat damage. Avoid that if at all possible. Next up, Commander's a political game. Don't make deals that don't benefit you. I see people do this sometimes because it's memey and it's funny to do it. It's really costing you games when you do that, when you give somebody a benefit that you don't have to, but you don't really have a good reason to do it. Good example of this coming from my own personal play group. Jose, I'm talking about you. You know what you did. Somebody will sometimes cast a card like Peer's Whim. That's the friend-foe card, where you get to name everybody at the table a friend or a foe. Every foe ends up sacrificing an artifact or enchantment of their choice. Every friend gets to search their library for a land and put it on the battlefield. Sometimes I'll see people who are deciding who's friend and foe, and the default should be all of your opponents are foe. There's no real reason to not name all of your opponents foe, but sometimes you'll see, oh, somebody doesn't have an artifact or enchantment to sacrifice. I might as well name them friend and foster some, friendship in this game and foster a partner. Don't do that. It doesn't benefit you in any way to give your opponent something if you're not getting something in exchange, especially when you're the one paying the mana to cast the spell that does that. Moving on to a few more small gameplay mistakes. Not paying the taxes for cards like Smother and Tithe and Rhystic Study. This is a well-documented complaint on the Twitterverse and other places where people talk about Magic. If you can afford to, you should be paying for Rhystic Study and Smother and Tithe. If you still have a play, even when you pay the 1 or 2 mana, go ahead and pay that. Otherwise, the person who has those permanents is going to spiral out of control. There is a point of no return. If all of your opponents, besides the person who has Rhystic Study, if everybody else is just going to let that person free roll cards and mana, at some point you have to decide that, hey, I'm not going to be the only person paying, and therefore you end up not paying, and that person gets even more cards and mana. If you're not going to destroy the Rhystic Study, if you're not going to destroy the Smother and Tithe, you should have a plan for making sure it doesn't get out of control by paying for stuff. Obviously, the people who play those cards can sometimes force a bunch of draws or stuff like that with like a wheel effect, and then it's kind of out of your hands. But when you draw your card for turn, look at it, examine your turn, think about your turn, think about how much mana you're going to spend. And if you can spare the 2 mana, just go ahead and pay for the Smother and Tithe. If you're going to cast a spell, go ahead and pay for the Rhystic Study. And make sure everybody at the table is kind of on the same page. If you see the first 2 players are paying the mana for Rhystic Study, you should probably follow suit. Otherwise, they're going to stop doing it if they see that you're just letting the person with Rhystic Study draw a bunch of cards. I don't really want to go into too much detail about this one because it's super annoying, but pay for the tax effects. Next up, very small one. Your card draw should be the first thing that you cast if you plan on multi-spell. And if you untap for turn and you know 100% that you are going to cast a Harmonize in your hand, you should do that before casting any other spells in your hand. Let's say you have Sakura Tribe Elder and Harmonize and you untap with 6 mana. If I cast Sakura Tribe Elder and then I cast Harmonize, I've used up all of my mana for the turn, and then I draw my cards, and I might draw a 2-drop or 3-drop in a land or something like that. That would have been better to play than Sakura Tribe Elder. If you play Harmonize first in that scenario, you get to see more options before you decide what to do with the other 2 remaining mana after you cast the Harmonize. Just general rule of thumb, cast your card draw first if you know for a fact that you are going to be casting card draw that turn. Final gameplay error I wanted to point out here, a very small thing that doesn't amount to too swingy of a decision or anything like that when it comes to EDH games, giving away free information. Good example of this is when you tutor up a land, you reveal it to all of your opponents, and then you put that land in your hand, and you play a different land for turn. Sometimes it's correct to do that, but your opponents now have information about a card in hand. The cards that I actually like to use here as an example of not giving away information are the Snarls, or the old Shadows over Innistrad versions. Cards like Port Town and Fortified Village. I think all of the Strixhaven ones were called Snarls. These are lands that come in the battlefield tapped, but if you reveal one of the basic land types of that color from your hand, they come in untapped. So, for example, the red-blue Snarl, Frostboil Snarl, it comes in tapped, but if you reveal an island or mountain from your hand, it comes in untapped. I see people do that a lot with no intention of using the mana, and they reveal an island or mountain from their hand. They pass the turn, it comes back around to them. They had no intention of using that mana, and now they just showed the rest of the table that one of the cards in their hand is a mountain or island. If that's their last card in hand, then the opponent knows they're completely clear. There's nothing to do, right? There's no interaction coming from that player. So just be careful about the information you give away in games of Commander. This matters a lot more for Constructed. It matters a lot more for Limited. In Commander, though, it can matter if your opponents can decipher the cards that are in your hand from the information that you're giving them. Okay, on to the mechanical mistakes, the biggest one of which applies especially to newer players, and that is not reading cards that you're not familiar with when they get played. This can be a little bit tedious for people who are new to the game. You know, me and my friend group, we kind of take it for granted at this point that we have like a pseudo encyclopedic knowledge of, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of Magic cards, and when we see a little piece of the art on a card you play, we know what the card does, we know how it functions, we know how it interacts with other cards. New players, especially people who aren't super familiar with Magic, don't have that. So if you're one of those players, you should be reading cards as people play them, especially when they're permanents on board. That way you know what the card does and how it interacts with everything else that's going in the game. And this is something that people who do know what all the cards do can help with. You should be good at either explaining what your cards do when they do something and fully explaining that. Magic players in general are so bad at explaining what cards do. They will often explain it very poorly. People love that ability that lets you like reveal the top card of your library, put it in your hand, and either gain or lose life equal to that mana value. There's a bunch of cards out there that do similar things, but they're all a little bit different. And just saying, oh, it's the Dark Confidant, that's not enough for a new player. You have to kind of explain what's going on with the cards. If you're new to the game, someone plays a card that you're just completely unfamiliar with, and they're not explaining what it does, ask if you can read that card real quick so that it doesn't catch you off guard. I think this is something that every player out there should be better at doing, is reading cards they don't know and explaining cards that they're playing to people who don't know what those cards are. Another small thing here, and this is just something that you can do to be a better Commander player and not lose track of the board state, is to represent your tokens and your counters well. I see people use Skittles for +1/+1 counters. I see people grab a piece of paper and tear a corner off, and that's a -1/-1 counter. If you can't bring counters with you every single time you go somewhere, that's fine. I'm not saying you have to be fully equipped for anything, but if you're a long-term Magic player, you should invest in at least a couple dice and a couple tokens to represent the things that you're doing on board. This will be clearer to you and will be clearer to other people. My least favorite thing in the world is when people use a card from their graveyard face down to represent a token, because that's messing with the graveyard and that ends up mattering in some situations. Or when people use a little tiny D6 die to represent like a 5/5 token, and then that die kind of slips your mind and you attack into it and they're like, oh, I have this 5/5 token. Things like that can be avoided easily by just having things that represent your tokens. If you don't have the exact tokens for every single card in your deck, that's fine, but bring a stack of tokens. Bring a couple things that make it easier for people to decipher what everything is on board. The last big mechanical thing here, and this is a mindset that players just kind of need to get over. It happens in every single format. Incidental mill and looting. The act of milling 3 or 4 cards or being forced to draw a couple cards and discard a couple cards is not going to hurt you. Obviously, if you're playing against the person at the local game store who's known to be the mill player and he's trying to mill you out, you should be a little bit wary of that person, and when they start milling you, you should be retaliating as if it was any other player attacking you or interacting with your permanents. But if somebody has a card that says each player mills 3 cards and do blah blah blah, you should not retaliate against that person. It's usually a benefit to you, and I can't stress this enough that in 100 card decks, getting milled 10 to 20 cards throughout the course of the game is a benefit to you, not a detriment. The same goes for looting. I have seen people who have decks where they're playing against somebody and that person is making them draw a bunch of extra cards for some reason, but the person who's drawing all the cards can't keep them. They don't have a reliquary tower, so they end up discarding cards for turn, and they retaliate against the person who's drawing them extra cards because, quote-unquote, I don't want to discard all these cards. You're making me discard these cards. I'm going to attack you for it. That person's helping you out. They're letting you smooth out your hand. You are improving the quality of your hand by drawing and discarding cards. Yes, it would be really nice if you got to keep all those cards, but that person's letting you see extra cards and sculpt a better hand. Maybe you draw 3 cards, all those cards suck, and you end up discarding those 3 cards. That didn't hurt you in any meaningful way. This is especially true of incidental mill. People freak out about getting milled. If you are not going to get milled out, if you're not realistically playing against a deck that is designed to exile your entire library or get rid of your entire library, then you should not be worried about mill. So don't freak out if people are milling you. If their game plan is to mill you out, that's when you should be freaking out and retaliating against that person. But incidental mill is a benefit to you, not a detriment. That brings us to the deck building error portion of this Scattered Thoughts episode. The first thing, the obvious thing, the thing that everybody does when they're building commander decks, cutting lands from your deck. As a default, I play 36 lands in pretty much every single deck. If it's a very mana-hungry deck or it doesn't have a lot of ramp or acceleration, I might go up to 38, but my default number is 36, and I never cut lands anymore from my deck. I do not go below 36 lands in any deck that I play. And I'm not saying that's the mathematically correct number or anything like that. I know people don't want to hear it, but sometimes the responsible cut is to cut a permanent from their deck or cut a creature from their decks, usually something on the high end. Don't cut the lands. It is going to come back and bite you, and it might not be obviously apparent when it does. The same goes for land adjustments in decks that you have just played for the first time. I actually see people do this quite often. This is a limited thing too, and a commander thing. People will play their commander deck that they just sleeved up. They'll get flooded that game, and as soon as they finish the very first game that they ever played with that deck, they'll say, oh, I drew too many lands. I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 and add these cards to the deck. You have a sample size of 1 game with that deck. Don't make that decision yet. Play it out a few more times. Play it at least 2 or 3 more times and see if that happens every single game. If literally every game you're playing you get flooded, you might want to make some adjustments. But if you play 2 or 3 more games and those games go smoothly, it might not have been necessarily a deck building error that caused you to flood out the first game. It might have just been variance. All right, 2 more small things in the deck building category here. First off, too many utility lands. This is another one that comes up very, very often. I'm talking specifically about 3+ color decks. So 3 color decks, 4 color decks, 5 color decks. Put in too many colorless utility lands in your deck that are conflicting with the color requirements of the cards that you need. That really does come back to bite you a certain amount of time. I think we've all had games where we've drawn our colorless land and we really need our blue mana, but we drew a colorless land instead, and if that colorless land had been some sort of tri-land or multicolor fixer instead, we would have been fine. The biggest offender here is always Reliquary Tower. I talk about this all the time with friend groups, and even on this mini cast, even on Scattered Thoughts, I've talked about this a couple times, but Reliquary Tower in your 3, 4, 5 color decks is just such an unnecessary thing unless your deck is designed to draw tons and tons of cards and needs a way to hold them, that it actually probably ends up hurting you more often than it helps you. Very rarely does Reliquary Tower actually let you hold extra cards, unless your deck's designed to do that. That I think there are more games where you would rather have a colored source of mana than a Reliquary Tower. And obviously there are decks out there where Reliquary Tower is perfectly fine, or, you know, an integral part of what you need for your deck, but it's not the staple everybody thinks it is. And I think it is harming you. I've seen people play these 3 or 4 color decks where they have a bunch of colorless utility lands and they have very stringent color requirements, and they end up drawing a colorless mana and they're like, oh man, I'm screwed on green mana. This is so unlucky. And it's like, well, no, you just put in a bunch of colorless lands in your 4 color deck. You kind of did that to yourself. So just be careful. Make sure you have an adequate number of sources of all the colors you need to cast your spells. Again, I'm not the mathematician here, so I can't tell you exactly how many of each color you need for a 3, 4, 5 color deck, but you should have an adequate amount. We'll go ahead and leave it at that. The final deck building error I want to point out here is to not play self-hosers in your own deck. Don't be the person who's beaten yourself. That's always a very awkward position to be in. A couple examples of this being things like playing too many Wraths in your creature-heavy deck. Yes, I said you have to have Sweepers in your deck, you have to have Wraths in your deck. You probably want 1 or 2 at minimum for almost every single deck you can play. But if you're a creature-heavy deck, you don't want to be wiping your own board every 5 seconds, so make sure you're either lighter on Wraths for that style of deck, or play some conditional Wraths that synergize with your deck. For example, if you're a heavy token deck, there's a sweeper out there that destroys all non-token creatures. That's the type of thing you're looking for. Another example, playing Bane of Progress just because it's a good card. It's on EDH Rec as one of the best green cards. I don't actually know if that's true or not, but playing Bane of Progress because you know it's good, but having a deck that's full of artifacts and enchantments. If you play your Bane of Progress and it's destroying like 5 or 6 of your own things, you're probably doing something during deck building that's not adding up. you probably want to look for an answer to artifacts and enchantments that doesn't mess with all of your own setup pieces and destroy everything that you've cast that turn or that game, right? So don't play cards that hose your own strategy. The example that I like to use is Karthus. I don't even know the full name of the card, but Karthus is this big dragon, big Jund dragon that gives all of your dragons haste. It might even have another ability. I think when it comes into play, it gains control of all dragons. And then all of your dragons have haste. Don't put Karthus in your dragon deck. It's a very minor benefit for your deck, but what happens is somebody else is going to clone Karthus or reanimate Karthus and take control of all of your dragons, and they're just going to crush you with all your own cards. It's kind of a gimmicky thing. I don't know too many people out there who actually even play Karthus, but it used to be a little bit more popular, and it's just a good example of a card that actually ends up hosing you more often than it helps you. Especially with Karthus, that's just a completely replaceable card in 2022 Magic. So let's avoid beating ourselves with our own cards, shall we? All right, and the final biggest piece of advice that I can give the people out there, don't play Demon Tribal. Come on, don't play Demon Tribal. What are you doing? All right, seriously, that is just a long list of mistakes that I wanted to go ahead and point out to people. I think if you avoid these things, and some of them are like weighted a little bit differently, obviously flashing in creatures with flash at sorcery speed is way worse than not attacking with your vigilance creature. But things like using your treasure before your land is a huge mistake that is costing you like lots of games by just throwing away equity, throwing away win percentage. Just tossing away your mana for no reason when you could have played differently to have extra mana. I think the big takeaway here for the gameplay aspect is to make informed decisions about what you're doing. The die rolling thing is just a huge irksome thing for me because it's kind of a fallback. It's the psychological fallback for people. I already went over it. I'm not going to rehash it, but make informed decisions. Attack people who are threats. A lot of people in my group, when I asked them for suggestions here, they wanted me to talk about threat analysis. And that's such a nebulous thing for Commander that it would probably take its own episode, and I'm not entirely sure how to approach that and talk about it as its own thing, but it was definitely too big and broad of a topic to identify who's the threat and stuff like that. But that's easy early on in the game, right? If somebody played Sylvan Library and everybody else is playing a bunch of tap lands and basics, like maybe attack the person with a Sylvan Library. That's easy threat analysis 101. All this other stuff, take it or leave it if you will, but hopefully there's something here that helps you. If you're a new player, I think the biggest thing I can stress is just becoming familiar with the cards. Not reading new cards is going to catch you off. Imagine someone plays a Navineral disc and, oh, they just played a tapped artifact. That's no big deal. I'm not going to read that card. And then next turn they're like, oh, I can blow everything up. Well, if you had read that card, you could have avoided just completely playing into it, right? There's a ton of other mistakes we could talk about. These are ones that kind of tug at me when I see people doing them, so I wanted to point these out and talk about them, but that's all I have for today. If you have any specific mistakes that come to mind that you think are very common, that people could avoid to become better Commander players, please let me know down in the comments below, or message me on one of the platforms on the screen. I think the Twitter is on the screen. You can tweet at me anytime. I don't really use Twitter that often, but come tweet at me. That being said, as always, remember that Jank Diver Gaming is a Cube-related Discord community. Haven't really talked about Cube too much in Scattered Thoughts, but we'll get to it one day. Feel free to join that Discord link in the description down below. You can join us for some Cube action currently on Sunday night, 7:30 Eastern Time. Even win some gems for Magic Arena occasionally if you do well enough. Completely free to play. Come join the Discord, hang out, talk to a lot of like-minded Magic individuals. That's it for Scattered Thoughts, episode 7? I think this might be episode 6. Oh, maybe I should check my notes. Thanks for watching Scattered Thoughts at any rate, whatever episode it is. My name's been Timothy with Scattered Thoughts and Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all next time.